Everyone, welcome back. It's very good to have you here. So it's time for a roundtable, and the roundtable is on AI and ethics for government records. And I thought I would start with just a few words about the need for more collaboration. So for those of you who missed this morning, my name is Lise Jaillant. I'm based at Loughborough University, and I'm an associate professor in digital humanities. And really today it was great to see so many people from various sectors. So I'm in academia, but of course many of you work in the archive sector, in information management. We have a lot of people in government. So it's very much, a mix of, all kinds of sectors and fields. So really what I wanted to say today is that we need to work together. We need to collaborate more. But let me say a few words about examples of unethical AI. And many of you will be familiar with this already. I mean, we have this issue with biased results due to poor training data. We have an issue with a black box. Even some of us don't like this expression, black box. But still, it's an issue of explainability. We have an issue with the lack of accountability. And of course, it's particularly problematic in the case of sensitive records, including, of course, government records. So we know that already, right? We know what unethical AI means. But let's go back to the definition of ethics. I often tell my students, when it's interesting, of course, that ethics, it's the study of moral principle, especially when we refer to as the principles of Aristotle. So basically, when we talk about ethics, it's very much related to philosophy. But in the broader sense, ethics, of course, means the codes of conduct or moral principles recognized in a particular profession, sphere of activity, relationship, or other context of aspect of human life. So if we try to put those two terms, ethics and artificial intelligence, next to each other, well, of course, ethics is linked to philosophy, artificial intelligence is linked to computer science, ethics is linked to the humanities, artificial intelligence to STEM. Ethics, of course, is related to qualitative methods, artificial intelligence to quantitative methods. And what's happening really is that there is a little communication between the two fields. And too often, ethics has been an afterthought in the development of AI. And again, if we're looking at the humanities, well, few humanities scholars have engaged with computer scientists. So really, my key point here is that often what's happening is that computer scientists do not engage with people who work on ethics, with philosophers and other people, and vice versa, basically. Okay, we have the humanities on one side, we have computer science on the other side. And last year at Loughborough, we organized a big event at the Institute of Advanced Study, and we invited a scholar called Lauren Klein. She's based in the US. She works on digital humanities, which is very much my field, as I said. And basically, she said AI research requires an expanded definition of who counts as an AI researcher. And I love this quotation, I use it all the time, because I think sometimes, we really associate AI only with computer scientists. And AI has an impact on all of us, really. So I think it's important that we try to expand this category of, what counts as an AI researcher. So I totally agree with Lauren Klein on this. So let me conclude with just a few words about, if we start with this expansion of the definition of AI researcher, well, perhaps we can think also of the expansion of the definition of ethics researcher. I mean, do you need to be a philosopher to think about ethics? Okay. Or, for example, I'm a literary scholar by training. Can I be an ethics researcher? So really, we need to think about perhaps broadening those categories. And again, I think we need more collaboration to make AI more ethical, more transparent, more explainable, and more accountable. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to share the roundtable with my colleagues Stephanie Decker and Adam Nix, who are going to say a few words about AI and ethics as well. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to move the laptop here.
Okay, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
that's fine.
Thanks.
People should be able to see you,
Okay.
hopefully.
Super. All right. Thank you very much. So, in talking about this, we were asked to give our perspective on to the roundtable, and I think in order to do that, I should probably sort of contextualize my perspective a little bit, given I don't, given the basis I have and my relationship with AI and government records. So, in that regard, I'm very much talking from my experience doing research in the context of a UK-based higher education institution. And in that sense, quite a few of my reflections here have a sort of institutional theme to them. So in this regard, the key ethical concerns that come up institutionally are around two things. They're around subject harm on the one hand, our research subjects, and also about research integrity. And those are, if you were to divide the two sort of themes that come up within a university research environment, those are the two ethical issues that we tend to deal with in that context. And in that regard, some of these comments go beyond government records specifically, although our experience dealing with these is very much from our use of government records, albeit US government records. And this very much sort of what I'm going to sort of say represents reflections rather than the substantive findings of research specifically around these issues. So with those caveats out of the way, and that said, thinking about sort of ethics and archival data more generally, first of all, from an institutional perspective, universities both in the UK and abroad, when we think about review boards and ethical approval, they tend to see secondary or archival data as low risk. For the most part, certainly lower risk than more primary forms of data, and this is even more accentuated when there is a sense that this data is already publicly available. At that point, there is an assumption that we've removed the issues around privacy, and therefore often these sort of research projects are moved through without even necessarily having to go through full approval. So in this regard, it sort of sees the researcher as the sort of primary agent of discovery in terms of the knowledge that they're generating through their research, but that any existing information has already been made known, and therefore they don't have to worry about that. So in that regard, the sort of question that I thought about in thinking about the topic we were asked to talk to here was whether these current systems of thinking around ethics and thinking around archival data from a research perspective actually still remain suitable and fit for purpose when we look at more AI mediated archival research and some of the features of that sort of research. So in this regard, some sort of relevant talking points or questions, for instance, might be, how does machine-assisted search change the risks and contingent liabilities in research collections that may be seen by research institutions as already publicly available, for instance, but actually potentially with new forms of search, new ways of searching, there is the chance that things are going to be brought to light that there is not necessarily an awareness of. Also, how does the sort of born digital nature of these sources change the way we look at privacy in archival data? For instance, we were talking earlier about that ambiguity around the individual and the organisation in some of the archival collections that we've been working with. And finally, how will we account for the sort of machine learning side of things within our research and design reporting? And that's something, again, we've picked up on today already, but it's something I think methodologically and in terms of how we then report our method, there's still a lack of sort of clarity around. And I think that's a key point on that sort of latter point of integrity.
Which one are we using now? It's that one. Okay. We've got the mic here, so that's okay. Yeah, I'm right. See your mic is there. Okay, right. So you can, I take it you can hear me okay. Yeah, so as Adam already said, we look at the issues around ethics, obviously, from the perspective of researchers. And very often, if you work with archives, you're very used to the problems that occur in terms of usage of data being already something that's been resolved in archival practice. So secondary data, anything to do with documents, generally seen as fine. But really, I think when we look at the kind of data sources that we looked at, it's not actually the case, because we get, people's individual emails. I've read emails about people discussing their home improvement schemes in what is an organizational data set. And I think for us, that's been sort of the primary ethical concern. There might be letters to solicitors, to lawyers. How do we deal with this? And we've really taken this from the perspective of, as a researcher, we should honor and respect, obviously, the kind of ethical frameworks when we deal with people who are essentially research subjects, even though we're not directly faced with them. They don't even know we're researching them. So in some ways, they're actually in a more vulnerable position. So we've tried to sort of handle the data with greater care than what we would normally do, because we understand that this layer and this check-in hasn't been there. And I think a lot of the debate and a lot of the institutional oversight has been around this issue of privacy. And that's been really interesting, because obviously privacy is the first thing that springs to mind. And as a result, we were quite happy to go to anonymization, even if anonymization or using pseudonyms is very imperfect in these kind of data sets. You can always kind of de-anonymize. It's entirely possible with enough information. But as we were doing this, we also began to realize that anonymization, that raises other issues. So we're assuming people want their privacy protected. But history is also about memory. Who's in the sources, who gets remembered? And this is why people are concerned about, what do we train an AI data set on? Because if the data set is biased, then the biases go into the actual algorithm. And we all know certain groups of people are better at leaving a historical record than others. We found that in some ways really directly with the data set we worked for the first project, where we created the digital history and then decided to anonymize everybody, because we were not allowed to actually contact them to say, would you want to be named in a history of a company? So people had no agency in whether they're anonymized or not. So we did the first round of anonymization, began to realize we went sort of just for random names. And these names obviously ended up being quite English, quite white. And that's not this one seems to be on again.
Oh, okay. No.
Can you hear us again online?
Yes.
Okay,
That's fine now.
As short sighted as Emma could read that. I'm not too sure at what point the mic went off. So going back, essentially, we used pseudonyms for people in our data set. And we went back a second time to recreate the sort of cultural diversity we found in that data set. And, when I say Indian surnames, the Indian subcontinent has lots of different groups, and names come with certain associations, which to a person from South India, from North India, would track as a specific person. So we really started trying to make sure we had culturally appropriate pseudonyms. Obviously, that will reduce the level of anonymization, right? It'll make it even easier to identify the person. On the other hand, we kind of felt, well, what are the two different values we're trying to balance here as ethical researchers? Also being mindful not just about a debate on privacy, but also about decolonizing of research. And we really felt, okay, at this point, we know anonymization is imperfect. But on the other hand, then if we're using a pseudonym, maybe we should have the pseudonym represent the groups within that data set. So that is, I think, something that came up from our research that we never found anybody debate. And we also felt this is a value that we potentially should weigh next to privacy. And we kind of feel that for as long as we don't know how we're supposed to handle this data and how are we actually able to work with research subjects directly to understand what they would want, it's really quite difficult because you're moving a little bit in the dark. But I think in terms of ethics, that was one of the key things that for us became a real issue and where we found very little guidance. And ultimately, this was our solution because we sort of felt as ethical researchers, this is sort of where we should balance overall.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Jenny, you're next.
Thank you. Yes. I think starting from the position that it's always easier to comment on other people's ethics than it is to reflect on your own. I think we've got sort of two sides to this. The first is the kind of the government record as sort of the record keeper's role, perhaps in keeping our organisations honest and that kind of side of it. And it's always nice to be on the moral high ground, isn't it? So it's from that angle, I think, obviously AI and the use of these systems for decision making within government is of concern to the record keeper, and in terms of kind of trying to keep up to date with kind of thinking about what documentation is required of that, what of that becomes the record, is needed for the record, how such things can be audited and sort of records of that audit be kept. So I think, you know, from that perspective, there's obviously one side to it and there's a lot of work there. I think my other angle is that it's sometimes, like I say, it's harder to reflect on your own. And I think what worries me slightly sometimes is that we're going to fall back into this myth of objectivity again. Archivists have form on this, shall we say. We like to pretend that we haven't had any impact on the record, that we've just hidden in the background and the record is what the record is. But now we've got an algorithm and we've got another way of saying, oh, well, it wasn't us. Appraisal was carried out by AI, you know, and that's very objective. It's reviewed all the data and it's a very objective thing. It's just worked on the data. So I think I worry slightly that we are, as we kind of embrace these tools for our own practices, we have to be very, very wary of that we don't, you know, fall back into our old ways of sort of pretending that we are objective and pretending that such decisions can ever be objective, whether they're made by a human or a machine. And then at the other end, I think, alluding to what Stephanie and Adam have said, it's this question of, you know, the archivist as gatekeeper. You know, we've spoken of dark archives, we've spoken of researchers wanting access, and generally speaking, archivists get sort of stuck in the middle of this quite a lot of the time. People want more access, they want more transparency, they want everything open, they want to be able to do what they want with it. And quite often archivists get a bad rap for saying no, because we are also considering harm, as researchers are, and sort of not just harm to sort of people who are living, people who are dead, people who are not yet to be born. And this question of as you know, as Adam was saying, as you can do computational analysis of this material, the risks of harm are arguably higher. So the risks of harm to more numbers of people is arguably higher. So does that mean we have to be, and I'm going to make myself very unpopular here, not necessarily even more stringent, but perhaps more controlling of use, in a way that what I'm trying to say here is alert people to the dangers. So this comes from what I was talking about when I said I've wrote this sort of data set for the web archive. And there's also these data nutrition labels that are out there, and this idea that you're labeling your data set as dangerous or risky to use for certain applications. So do not use this data set for this kind of application, because, you know, it wasn't created with any community engagement. It is completely biased. And I'm kind of almost feeling that I should be slapping warning labels all over my archive saying, you know, this is dangerous stuff. Don't use it for this purpose. Or if you use it for this purpose, you have to be aware of X, Y, and Z. Now, you could argue that that's always been the case, but it sort of becomes amplified somehow, or it becomes feeling more of a pressure, or you're more aware of the greater harm that can be done. So I think in the access space, the kind of management of that harm and thinking around that harm and how we kind of moderate and mediate that is going to be a really big thing in the future. So I'm going to just stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny. And really, that's a wonderful start of the conversation, just because, I mean, as you know, I'm really, I've written quite a few articles about access, and sometimes, you know, I'm really pushing for access to those documents. So do you think that archivists, in a way, have this bad role as people who have to say no, and, you know, who have to be the bad cop, in a way?
Well, we have an ethical responsibility. So it's not that we have to say no, but we have an ethical responsibility, which is to consider all of this, not just the legal framework. Obviously, we operate within a legal framework, and you know, the legal framework will change slowly, but the ethical framework as well is also always changing. So I think it's maybe just more about collaboration, as you say, more understanding. I don't know how you solve it, but yes, I do feel that we have the ethical responsibility. And I also feel that you're on the front line. So I used to sort of, you know, actually sit in the reading room and talk to people, and I had people dissolving into tears because I couldn't give them access to a record. You know, I've felt the, you know, the emotional and the empathy, and I feel that if you take that, you're not going to take this ethical responsibility lightly. You can see the real world impacts it has on, you know, individuals every day, to some extent. So yes, I don't think that's an answer. I'm just saying, please be kind to your archivists, perhaps, when they say no. That's what I'm saying. Don't shout at them.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on this. I mean, obviously, we are talking about digital records today, but, you know, this issue of sensitivity and access to sensitive documents, I mean, that's not a new issue, right? It was always the case that some records are extremely sensitive. So do you think that perhaps researchers are being a bit difficult here, because it's not a new problem, right?
I think there's something, I mean, it's not a new problem, no, but it is about amplification, perhaps. And so it's a sort of new order of an old problem, perhaps.
Can I maybe come in here? Because we had a conversation at coffee about something similar, because one of the things I hadn't really thought about before, but if you think about the size of the records held in the TNA, and if you had records by, say, specific people that are very much in the limelight, and you'd get all their records, and we're talking about deep fakes that are being possible just visually, but look at OpenAI, you would be able to just recreate their style to the point that a forensic analyst wouldn't be able to tell it apart from the real thing. So I think some of the harms that may come out of this large scale use of data, we probably can't know yet. And I think it's against a balance about how careful should you be. I mean, you can't lock everything down. But yeah, I think there might be new harms, new risks out there that we don't yet see. And that will be a problem. I think that's not a reason to shut down access entirely. Yeah, but I do think we need to be mindful that some of these risks might need to be very carefully managed.
And I think that there's a balance to be had in the sense that some records will clearly require a very strict and absolute decision to be made on them, and others maybe less so. And I think at that point, perhaps is where you have more scope for there to be more of a collaborative relationship with the researcher and to us holding a collection in terms of how that record is used, engaged with, and ultimately reported. And I think to go back to a sort of the point I was making, I think it sounds like Turkey's voting for Christmas, but lifting slightly the acknowledgement of the risks around some of these materials when we think about the research side of the ethics is actually in a way potentially quite a liberating thing, because it allows us to acknowledge our responsibility as researchers more when we're using this sort of data, and also then play a more active role in working to make sure those are used responsibly and that there is no harm and integrity is maintained.
Absolutely. So do you think the processes are in place at the moment, sir?
I don't think the ethical processes in universities is fundamentally broken by any means. I should clarify. I do think that there are some assumptions around data that's secondary in nature and archival in nature, and particularly public in nature, around the risks that represents both to the institutions and to the researchers and to the subjects involved. And I think the space we're in at the moment, where we are really changing how we're engaging with some of those records means that we do need to always be critical about whether what we've got in place is fit for purpose. And I think that is no less true now than it's ever been, if not.
Yeah, and I think you're right that, you know, there is a tendency for archivists to take it all on themselves. And the best way to, sorry, this is my parenting skills. The best way to get somebody to take responsibility is to give them the responsibility and to trust them with it to that extent. And I'm just thinking of one sort of model that I've heard of is where, because also with digital, what we're talking about is a time frame squeezing. So, you know, for quite a lot of our records, archivists have had to sort of take on this responsibility because the people involved are dead. But that's not necessarily the case these days. So, you know, is there a sort of mechanism whereby, and this has been done, for example, with hard drives. So if somebody's doing some research that's involving kind of complete disk images or whatever, but the creator is still alive, there's a sort of general use statement. But if that researcher is doing that kind of form of research that is involving, you know, recreating deleted files and that sort of thing, do they actually have their own agreement with the creator? Yeah, so they can have their own sort of agreement, so that there's a discussion there, and you know, you sort of cut out the middleman. The archivist doesn't get stuck in the middle because the researcher is dealing directly with the creator. So there could be models for that as well, perhaps, which would be one way of doing that.
It's interesting that you mentioned record creators, because of course sometimes we don't really engage with them. I mean, as you said, it used to be the case that people were dead and then the archives arrived, you know, at the library. But yeah, some people are still alive. So I think we need to have this conversation also with record creators, you know, people who might be interested in depositing their archives and so. Absolutely. Do we have questions in the room, perhaps? Anything people want to ask the roundtable at this point? James?
There is a question online. Which
okay, would you like to? Okay, let's have a look. Yeah.
Which is, as a thought experiment, could you imagine a data set that is so toxic it can be created or collected?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm pretty sure we've seen quite a lot of them already, and they're normally in criminal investigations. I mean, that's the first thing I would think. I'm not sure whether in archival practice you've come across anything that you'd think is toxic in a non-criminal way. I don't know.
Well, I think this is where my sort of archival long-termism comes. Toxicity deteriorates over time. Radioactive elements have quite a long half-life, right? And it's the same thing perhaps with this. So a data set so toxic it shouldn't be created.
Shouldn't be collected or acquired by an archive.
Collected or acquired by an archive, no, because that's kind of goes against everything I believe in. But that's why those kind of access restrictions are there, that, you know, toxicity will decline and sensitivity will change and all of this will happen. And if you remove all of the bad bits of history.
Yeah, but I mean, on the other hand, if you think Hitler's Mein Kampf is still banned in Germany, it is still seen as that.
It's a very, very long half-life.
Yeah,
and that's contextually specific.
Perhaps, but then you can think about things like Trump, the argument about, you know, how social media and the wider media has been used. On the other hand, if we don't maintain these sources, how will we ever learn about the techniques, the red flags to counteract? So it's an interesting problem, isn't it?
It's of course also highly subjective and requires an acknowledgement that at some level you need some form of social control agency to designate toxicity. And that's going to have to be based on some form of ethical logic, whether that's, you know, the benefit does not outweigh the potential harm or what have you, but that will always be on a context specific basis, I think. I mean, just as you use the sort of metaphor of toxic, it reminded me of the old sort of truism about pollution, which is dilution is the solution to pollution. But of course, in archive terms, that's completely wrong. You don't want to have the toxic stuff in there, but just dilute it with a load of ephemera, because then you've just hidden all the nasty stuff, and it's still there, having that sort of underlying potential risk. So but that's an aside.
Yeah, and pushing the metaphor to the end, you know, radioactive waste material is very expensive to store. for a very long time, and same is true of lives. So perhaps there's a cost benefit.
No, I really like this metaphor.
Spoken like a true alchemist.
Okay, so I think that's a good way to conclude our online workshop. We still have a bit of time for people who can stay with us, for coffee and tea. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, people in the roundtable as well. I think it was a wonderful day, and please keep an eye on our website because we are going to announce more workshops, more talks. So there will be a chance, hopefully, to see you again. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.